It all started as an ordinary road trip. We were just a group of friends seeking a weekend adventure far from the noise of the city. No phones, no GPS, just a map and our instincts guiding us into the unknown. Jason was driving, as usual. He loved the freedom of the open road, and we trusted his knack for finding the most hidden spots, places that didn't show up on any travel guide. This time, though, we may have followed him a little too far off the beaten path. The day had started off warm and sunny, perfect for an escape. We packed our bags, stocked up on snacks, and hit the road, heading towards a rural area we'd never heard of before. The roads became narrower, the trees taller, and soon, even the pavement disappeared, leaving us on a dusty, winding path. As we passed by scattered farms and abandoned houses, we joked about finding the perfect ghost town. Little did we know how close we were to making that joke a reality. After hours of driving, with no sign of civilization, the road forked into an unfamiliar dirt trail. Jason, always the adventurer, decided to take it, despite our groans of protest. "Just trust me," he said with a grin. "I've got a feeling about this." The landscape changed almost immediately. The trees became denser, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. The air grew cooler, and the silence of the woods felt almost oppressive. The further we drove, the more isolated we felt, as if we were being swallowed by the forest. We kept driving for what felt like hours, the sense of unease growing with every mile, when suddenly we saw it. In the middle of nowhere, hidden behind a wall of towering trees, was a small village. It looked old, almost like something out of a history book. The houses were simple, built from stone and wood, with thatched roofs and narrow streets that seemed frozen in time. No signs, no cars, no power lines. Just this little village, nestled in the heart of the forest, as if forgotten by the world. We exchanged nervous glances. "This place isn't on the map," I said, pulling out the crumpled piece of paper we had been using to navigate. The village didn't exist on it, but there it was right in front of us, and curiosity got the best of us. Jason parked the car at the edge of the village, and we stepped out, taking in the strange sight before us. The air felt heavier here, colder, as if the village itself was breathing. There were people, or at least, we assumed they were people. Figures moved slowly between the buildings, dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothes. They didn't speak, didn't even seem to notice us. They just went about their day like clockwork, performing the same tasks over and over again. Sweeping the streets, tending to small gardens, walking in circles. "Okay, this is weird," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She was right. There was something deeply unsettling about the place. It was too quiet, too still, and yet we couldn't help but feel drawn to it, like something was pulling us in. We decided to walk through the village, hoping to find someone who could explain where we were. As we wandered deeper into the narrow streets, the sensation that we didn't belong there grew stronger. Every step we took seemed to echo, though the villagers paid us no mind. It was as if we were invisible. "I don't like this," Aaron muttered, looking around nervously. "We should go." But it was too late for that. Something about this place had us in its grip, and deep down we all knew it. Something was waiting for us here, something we couldn't yet understand. As we ventured further into the village, the sense of unease grew. It wasn't just the silence or the way the air seemed to hang thick around us. It was the people, or whatever they were. The villagers moved with a strange rhythm, as though they were rehearsing a play that they had long forgotten the purpose of. No one spoke. Not a single sound came from their mouths, yet they moved, interacting with each other in the most mechanical way possible. At first, we thought it was some kind of historical reenactment, an elaborate tourist trap hidden away from the main roads. But there was no humor here, no playfulness. Their faces were blank, eyes vacant, and even though they passed by us, not one of them made eye contact. It was as if we didn't exist in their world. Jason, always the brave one, stepped toward an elderly man who was sweeping the front of a small, worn-down shop. "Excuse me, sir?" he asked, his voice sounding louder than usual in the dead quiet of the village. The old man didn't react. Jason moved closer, waving a hand in front of his face, but there was no acknowledgement. The man continued his sweeping, the same motion over and over again, like a wind-up toy stuck in an endless loop. Maybe he's hard of hearing, Sarah suggested, though her voice was shaky. I wasn't convinced. There was something off about all of them. The way they moved, the way they ignored us, it was unnatural. We wandered deeper into the village, hoping to find anyone who could tell us where we were, or at least react to our presence. The streets were narrow and winding, each turn leading us to more strange sights. Women dressed in old-fashioned bonnets carried baskets of food that looked like it had been freshly harvested. Children played in the dirt, running in circles with no real joy in their movements. A man chopped wood, over and over, his axe hitting the same spot with unnatural precision. But none of them acknowledged us. They just kept moving as though trapped in their repetitive tasks. What the hell is this place? Aaron muttered under his breath. None of us had an answer. We tried speaking to more of the villagers, but each encounter was the same. Silence, blank stares, and that haunting, mechanical rhythm to their actions. It was as if they weren't really there, as if they were shadows of people who once lived, doomed to repeat the same tasks for eternity. We stopped near the center of the village where a fountain stood, its water still and covered in a thin layer of grime. Around it, a few villagers gathered, but they didn't speak, didn't interact. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on nothing, as if waiting for something or someone. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." We all felt it, the overwhelming urge to get away from this place. It wasn't just strange. It felt wrong, like we had stumbled into something we weren't meant to see. Jason nodded, and we turned to head back to the car, picking up the pace as the quiet pressed in on us from all sides. But when we reached the spot where we had parked, the car was gone. For a moment, none of us said anything, the realization settling in slowly, like a weight on our chests. Jason ran his hand through his hair, confused. "We parked it right here, didn't we?" "Yeah," I replied, looking around. The empty spot where the car should have been was unmistakable. There were no signs of it being towed, no marks in the dirt where it could have driven off. It was just gone. Aaron began to panic. "Someone stole it. We need to find help. Maybe the villagers know something." But the idea of going back to them, to those strange, silent people, filled us all with dread. Still, we had no choice. We retraced our steps, heading back toward the village center. But when we reached it, the scene had changed. The villagers were no longer moving. They stood frozen, their eyes finally meeting ours. And that was when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not just by them, but by something bigger, something unseen, lurking just beyond the edges of the village. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We're not welcome here." I couldn't argue with her. The feeling of hostility was thick in the air now, and the once harmless, if strange, villagers had become something far more menacing. Their blank stares were no longer empty. There was something behind those eyes, something ancient and dangerous. Without another word, we turned and ran. We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we had to get out. The village had come alive in a way none of us had expected, and whatever was happening here, we didn't want to be a part of it. But as we ran, something horrifying happened. No matter which direction we took, every path led us back to the same place, the village center. We circled around, taking different streets, trying to find a way out, but it was like the village itself was keeping us trapped. "This isn't possible," Jason said, his voice laced with fear. "We're going in circles." The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the village. And with every minute that passed, the place felt more alive, more aware of our presence. The villagers had resumed their strange tasks, but now, every once in a while, one of them would glance in our direction, as if waiting for us to make a move. We were trapped, and we had no idea how to escape. The panic set in quickly after we realized we were stuck. Every street, every path we took seemed to lead us right back to the center of the village, as if the roads themselves were playing tricks on us. Jason, who had been our confident leader until now, was starting to crack. He kept glancing around, shaking his head in disbelief, muttering, "This doesn't make any sense." And he was right. Nothing about this made sense. It was as if the village existed in its own twisted version of reality, where logic didn't apply. "We've already been down this street," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she pointed toward a narrow alley. "I'm sure of it." Aaron, breathing heavily, wiped sweat from his brow. "So, what do we do? Keep walking in circles? We need to figure out where we are." I could feel the fear in his voice, and it mirrored my own. The sun was now dipping behind the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the village. As night began to fall, the oppressive atmosphere only grew worse. It was like the village was closing in on us, its streets narrowing, its buildings looming taller. Every time we thought we had found a way out, we ended up back in the same place, standing in the middle of the village, with the silent, eerie fountain at its center, and those strange villagers still moving in their rhythmic, mechanical way. "We need to stay calm," Jason said, though it was clear he was barely holding it together. "There's got to be some logical explanation for this. Maybe we missed a road? Or we're trapped," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with panic. "You've seen it, Jason. No matter which way we go, we end up back here. We're not leaving." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, not just because of the way she said them, but because I knew, deep down, she was right. Something was keeping us here. Something we couldn't see or understand. And the worst part was, it was starting to feel like it didn't matter what we did, this village wasn't going to let us go. "I'm going to try again," Aaron said suddenly, his voice filled with determination. Without waiting for any of us to agree, he started down one of the streets, the same one we had already walked countless times. We watched as his figure grew smaller in the distance, his pace quickening with each step, almost as if he believed he could outrun whatever force was keeping us trapped. We waited, holding our breath, watching the alley he had disappeared down. Minutes passed, the silence of the village pressing in on us. Then we saw him, walking back toward us from the opposite direction. Aaron's face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion. I don't understand," he whispered, looking around as if he were still trying to make sense of what had just happened. I walked straight. I didn't turn back. But somehow, I'm here again. None of us knew what to say. We were all feeling the same terror that was gripping him, though no one wanted to admit it. The village was playing with us, manipulating our every move, and we were powerless to stop it. "We need to think," Jason said, pacing in front of the fountain. "There's got to be some explanation for this. Maybe the village is built in a circle or something, like a maze." Sarah shook her head. "A maze would have exits. This place doesn't." We stood there, the four of us, looking at each other helplessly as the last rays of sunlight faded completely, plunging the village into darkness. The street lamps flickered on, casting a dim, yellow glow that did little to cut through the thick shadows. And that's when we realized there was no sound. The village was completely silent. No crickets, no wind rustling the trees, not even the distant murmur of voices from the villagers. It was like the village was holding its breath, waiting. "I don't like this," Aaron muttered, his eyes darting around nervously. "Something's wrong. We need to find a place to stay. Just for the night." The idea of staying here, of spending the night in this cursed village, filled me with dread. But what choice did we have? It wasn't like we could keep wandering the streets, hoping for a way out that didn't exist. We needed to rest, regroup, and figure out what to do next. There, Sarah pointed to a small inn at the edge of the square. The building looked older than the others, its windows dark and its doors slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. "Are you sure?" I asked, not liking the look of it. "We don't have many options," she replied, already walking toward it. Jason followed her, and Aaron and I exchanged a glance before reluctantly heading after them. The inn creaked as we stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The air was stale, as though the place hadn't been occupied in years. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. "This place gives me the creeps," Aaron muttered under his breath. "Just for the night," Jason reminded us, though his voice sounded less confident than before. "We'll figure this out in the morning." We gathered in the main room of the inn, lighting a few candles we found on a dusty shelf. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the place feel even more unsettling. We sat in silence, too tired and too scared to talk about what had just happened. Outside, the village remained still, the strange inhabitants continuing their endless routines, completely unaware of the passing time. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what this place really was. Was it a hallucination? Some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there something far more sinister going on? I didn't know, but I could feel the weight of the village pressing down on us, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that inn. Sleep did not come easily that night. Despite the exhaustion from walking in endless circles and the mental strain of trying to make sense of our situation, there was something about the inn that kept me on edge. I could hear the old wooden beams creaking, as though the building itself was alive, breathing with us inside it. The air was thick and damp, carrying the smell of mold and age, but it wasn't just that. There was something else, something that made my skin crawl. Every shadow cast by the flickering candles seemed to dance a little too long, a little too strangely, as if something was lurking just beyond the dim light. Jason had fallen asleep quickly, sprawled out on one of the moth-eaten couches in the corner of the main room. Sarah sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the flame of the candle in front of her, lost in thought. Aaron hadn't said a word since we entered the inn. He sat near the door, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room nervously, like he was waiting for something, maybe even someone. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the village outside or the strange villagers going about their mechanical routines. It was something else, something that watched from the corners, from the cracks in the walls, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the creaking wood. I sat up, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that made my ears strain to pick up even the faintest sound. But then, faintly I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere within the inn. Jason stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Aaron tensed, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the dark hallway that led deeper into the building. "Someone's here," he muttered under his breath, standing up cautiously. Sarah and I exchanged a nervous glance before I slowly rose to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, moving closer, though the hallway remained pitch black. The candlelight only stretched so far, and whatever was making those sounds was just beyond its reach. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But before we could even decide what to do next, the door to the inn creaked open. All of us froze, watching as the heavy wooden door swung inward, the hinges groaning loudly in the dead silence. For a long moment, no one appeared. The doorway remained empty, dark, and cold air began to seep into the room, making the flames flicker wildly. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the open door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped inside. It was one of the villagers. He was an older man, his face lined with age, his eyes vacant and clouded. His movements were slow, almost lethargic, as he stepped further into the room. He didn't look at us. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, as if he were unaware of our presence entirely. "Excuse me," Jason said, his voice thick with sleep as he groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He just kept standing there, unmoving like a statue. His eyes were open, but there was no recognition in them, no life. Jason stood up, taking a step closer, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't," I whispered, my voice low. "Something's wrong." Aaron, now standing by the door, was visibly shaking. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, backing away from the man. "Why is he just standing there?" The figure slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto us for the first time. There was something deeply unsettling in that gaze, something unnatural. He took a step toward us, and then another, his feet dragging slightly across the floor. Sarah let out a small gasp, backing up into the wall, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered urgently. But before we could make a move, the man stopped. His head tilted to the side in a jerky, almost mechanical motion, and then he opened his mouth. No words came out, but there was a sound, a low, guttural noise that sent a chill down my spine. It was like the man was trying to speak, but whatever was inside him wouldn't let him. Without warning, the candle nearest to him went out, plunging that side of the room into darkness. The sudden shift in light made the shadows seem to grow, stretching toward us like long fingers reaching for our throats. "We're leaving now," Jason said, his voice firm as he grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. None of us argued. We moved quickly toward the door, not daring to look back at the strange villager who now stood completely still, half shrouded in shadow. I could feel his eyes on us, even as we hurried out into the cold night air. Once outside, we paused, trying to catch our breath. The village was just as quiet as before, the same unsettling silence hanging over everything. But now it felt different, more menacing. The villagers, those strange people we had seen going about their routines earlier, were no longer visible. The streets were empty. "We need to get out of here," Aaron said, his voice shaky. "We can't stay another minute in this place." "We've tried every road," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." I looked around, my heart racing. The village seemed darker now, more suffocating. Every building loomed over us, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The streets were twisting, narrowing, closing in. Jason ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "We'll figure it out," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. We were trapped in a place that defied logic, a village that didn't appear on any map. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like the village itself was alive, feeding off our fear, tightening its grip on us with each passing hour. And as we stood there in the cold night air, trying to decide what to do next, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real nightmare was only just beginning. We were no longer just lost. We were being watched, hunted, and whatever was lurking in the shadows of this forgotten village, it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. The darkness was swallowing us whole, and with every step we took away from the inn, the village seemed to shift around us, like it was alive, rearranging itself to keep us trapped. The cold air bit at our skin, and the silence was overwhelming, only broken by the sound of our hurried footsteps. Jason, always the one with a plan, was unusually quiet. He led the way with determined strides, though I could tell by the way his eyes darted around that he was just as lost as the rest of us. "We need to find out what's going on here," he finally said, his voice low and tense. "There has to be something, some explanation. People don't just disappear off maps. Villages don't act like this." Sarah, who had been quiet since the encounter with the villager in the inn, spoke up. "Maybe it's not the village," she whispered. "Maybe it's us." Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and unsettling. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I was starting to wonder if she was right. Something was wrong with this place, something beyond our understanding. But whether it was the village itself or something we had unwittingly stumbled into, I couldn't tell. We kept walking, though it felt like we were moving in circles again. The streets were narrow, winding, and even though we thought we were taking new paths, every corner seemed to lead us back to the center of the village. The same old fountain, now dark and looming, stared back at us like a silent sentinel. "We've been here before," Aaron muttered, his frustration evident. "We can't keep going around in circles. We have to figure out why this is happening," Jason said, his voice sharp with tension. "There's something we're missing." As we debated our next move, a thought struck me. "The villagers," I said, my voice breaking the uneasy silence. "They know something. They have to." Jason frowned, but before he could respond, Sarah nodded. "He's right. We haven't seen anything like this before. They live here. They're part of this whatever it is. Maybe they know how to leave." "We've tried talking to them," Aaron argued. "They're practically zombies." I could see the hesitation in his eyes, but at this point, we didn't have many options. We had already tried leaving, and the village had pulled us back each time. It was as if the roads were stitched together, leading us in endless loops with no way out. But the villagers, Something about them was off, and I had the sinking feeling that they knew more than they let on. "We'll find out more," Jason said after a moment. "But we have to be smart about it." We split up, not wanting to draw too much attention to ourselves. Jason and Sarah headed toward the houses on one side of the square, while Aaron and I moved toward the far side of the village, where the older, more dilapidated buildings stood. The air felt heavier here, thicker, as if we were walking through some unseen barrier that separated this part of the village from the rest. As we approached one of the larger, older buildings, Aaron stopped, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something on the ground. "Look at this," he said, crouching down to examine the dirt near the base of the building. I knelt beside him, and that's when I saw it too. Faint, but unmistakable. Footprints. But these weren't the same dragging, lifeless prints we had seen from the villagers. These were fresher, deeper, like someone had been moving quickly, perhaps running. "Someone else is here," Aaron said quietly, glancing around. Or they were. The realization hit me hard. We weren't the only outsiders here. Someone else had been in this village, maybe even before us, and they had left these footprints behind. But where had they gone? Before I could process what this meant, we heard something, movement coming from inside the building. Aaron and I exchanged a glance, and without a word, we slowly made our way to the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, we could see a dim light flickering inside. "Do you think someone's in there?" I whispered. Aaron nodded, his face pale but determined. "Only one way to find out." We pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The building was even more run down than it appeared from the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the smell of decay was strong, but there was a faint light coming from deeper within the structure. We followed it, our footsteps cautious and deliberate. As we moved further inside, the light grew brighter, and we found ourselves standing at the entrance to a small room. At the center of the room, on a rickety table, was an old, leather-bound book. Next to it, a single candle flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Aaron stepped forward, picking up the book. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I moved closer, peering over his shoulder. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing faded but still legible. It was a journal, filled with cramped, hurried handwriting. As Aaron flipped through the pages, we realized it wasn't just any journal. It was a record, a detailed account of someone's experience in the village. "This person," Aaron began, scanning the pages quickly. "They were trapped here, just like us. They couldn't leave. Every time they tried, they were brought back. And the villagers, they're not what they seem." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Aaron's face was pale as he read the next few lines. "The villagers, they aren't real. At least, not anymore. They were once, but now they're trapped. Stuck in some kind of cycle, repeating the same actions over and over again." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "So, we're stuck here too? Like them?" Aaron shook his head. "No, not yet, at least. But the person who wrote this, they think the village is cursed. And unless we figure out how to break it, we'll end up like them. Trapped here forever." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. The village wasn't just some forgotten place. We had stumbled into something far darker, far more sinister. And if we didn't find a way out soon, we would become part of it. Just like the villagers. "We need to show this to the others," Aaron said, closing the book carefully. "Maybe there's something in here that can help us." As we turned to leave the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us from the shadows. The village had been waiting for us, and now it was only a matter of time before it claimed us too. The moment Aaron and I stepped out of the old building, the cold hit us like a wave, more intense than before, almost unnatural. The village felt different now, like it was tightening its grip on us, wrapping us in its unseen chains. We moved quickly, keeping our heads down, the journal clutched tightly in Aaron's hands. The dim light from the street lamps barely cut through the thickening fog that seemed to rise from the ground, swirling around our feet as we hurried back toward the center of the village. When we finally reached the fountain, Jason and Sarah were already waiting, their faces tense with worry. They'd been looking for us, clearly unnerved by the strange atmosphere that had settled over the village. Jason stepped forward the moment he saw us, his eyes narrowing when he noticed the book in Aaron's hands. "What's that?" he asked, his voice strained. Aaron held up the journal. "It's a record. Someone else was here before us. They wrote everything down, what they went through, what they discovered. This place, it's cursed, Jason. The village, the people, everything." Sarah paled. "Cursed? What do you mean?" "We're trapped here because of it," Aaron explained, flipping open the journal and scanning the pages again. "Whoever wrote this figured out that the village isn't just some forgotten place. It's like a prison. The villagers, they're stuck, repeating the same routines over and over, like they're part of the village itself. They're not alive. Not really." Jason frowned, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "That doesn't make any sense." "None of this makes sense," I snapped, feeling the frustration bubble up inside me. "But we've been walking in circles all day. We can't leave. That much is obvious. This place isn't normal, and if we don't do something, we're going to end up like them." Sarah looked down at the journal, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the worn cover. "So, what are we supposed to do? How do we break the curse?" Aaron scanned the next few pages, his eyes flicking back and forth as he absorbed the words. "According to the journal, the village is tied to something old. There's a source, a place where the curse was born. Whoever wrote this believed that destroying that source would break the cycle and free everyone trapped here." Jason let out a frustrated sigh. "And where's this source supposed to be?" Aaron shook his head. "It doesn't say exactly, but it does mention something about the heart of the village. That's all we've got. The heart of the village." The words echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. What did that even mean? The fountain? One of the buildings? Or something buried beneath the village itself? "We need to find it," Jason said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Whatever this source is, it's our only way out." Sarah nodded reluctantly, her eyes darting around nervously as if she expected the villagers to materialize out of the darkness at any moment. "But where do we start?" As if on cue, a soft sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, like the sound of footsteps on gravel. All four of us turned in unison, our hearts pounding as we searched the shadows. The villagers, who had been so eerily still for hours, were moving again. Slowly, methodically, they began to emerge from the alleyways and doorways, their blank, expressionless faces illuminated by the dim street lamps. "They're coming," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. Aaron clutched the journal tighter, his knuckles white. "We have to move. Now." Without another word, we took off, running through the narrow streets, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the cobblestone. The villagers didn't run, didn't hurry after us. They just followed, their slow, deliberate movements keeping pace with our flight, as though they knew there was no escape. The village itself seemed to shift as we ran. The streets, which had already felt like a maze, became even more twisted, more convoluted. No matter which direction we took, we ended up in places that didn't make sense, back where we started, or at dead ends that hadn't been there before. "This place is alive," Jason muttered as we skidded to a stop at the edge of a small, overgrown garden. "It's moving. It's trying to keep us here." I didn't want to believe him, but it was hard to argue with what we were seeing. The village was changing, adapting to our every move, making sure we couldn't escape. It was like a predator, herding its prey into a corner. "We need to find the heart," Aaron said again, his voice frantic now. "The source. It has to be close." We pushed through the garden, our movements frantic, the weight of the curse pressing down on us like a vice. And then, suddenly, we saw it. A building we hadn't noticed before, hidden at the far end of the village, shrouded in shadows. It was different from the others, larger, more imposing, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch us like eyes in the darkness. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It has to be." We didn't hesitate. We ran toward the building, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as the cold air burned our lungs. The door was heavy, creaking ominously as we pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. It was colder here, more oppressive, as if the air itself were filled with malice. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and resting on it was an object, a small, blackened relic that pulsed with a strange, unnatural energy. The source, Aaron breathed, stepping closer, his hand trembling as he reached out toward the relic. But before he could touch it, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening crash. The villagers, those lifeless, soulless beings, were outside, surrounding the building, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "They know we're here," I whispered, backing away from the door. "They're not going to let us destroy it." Jason stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Then we don't have a choice. We have to destroy it now." Aaron hesitated for only a moment before nodding, his hand finally closing around the relic. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally heavy, and as he lifted it, a strange, guttural sound filled the air, like the village itself was screaming. "Do it," Sarah urged, her eyes wide with fear. "Break it!" Aaron raised the relic high, and with a swift motion, he brought it crashing down onto the stone pedestal. The relic shattered with a violent explosion of light and sound, and for a moment, everything went black. The moment the relic broke, we felt it, a shift in the air, a release. The oppressive weight that had hung over us since we arrived was gone, and the village, it was silent. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that fills your ears so completely that you start to question if you've gone deaf. The village, which had once felt so alive and malevolent, was now still. The air was no longer thick with that oppressive, cold weight. It felt lighter, like something had been lifted. We stood there, motionless, staring at the shattered remains of the relic, unsure of what would happen next. Aaron was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did it work?" Jason, still gripping the edge of the pedestal, shook his head slowly. "I don't know." Outside, the villagers were gone. The faint glow in their eyes, the lifeless, mechanical way they moved, all of it had vanished. The streets were empty. The oppressive presence that had been stalking us was nowhere to be felt. It was as if the village had gone to sleep, finally at rest. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She took a step toward the door, hesitant, as though she expected it to slam shut again, trapping us inside forever. But when she reached for the handle, it opened easily. The night air rushed in, cool and refreshing, as if the village itself was breathing normally for the first time in years. We stepped outside, all of us scanning the empty streets with a mixture of disbelief and caution. The buildings stood silent, the once eerie glow from the street lamps now dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed less threatening. Even the fountain in the center of the village was still, its water no longer flowing, just a pool of stagnant liquid reflecting the pale moonlight. "We should try to find a car," I said quietly, though my voice still felt too loud in the now peaceful village. No one argued. We moved as a group, cautiously making our way through the winding streets. This time, there were no twists, no strange loops that brought us back to the center. It was as if the village had stopped playing its cruel game. It was just a place again, old, forgotten, but no longer alive with the curse that had ensnared us. After a few minutes of walking, we found the car exactly where we had left it, parked on the edge of the village. It looked almost out of place now, sitting there in the quiet, normal in a way that felt strange after everything we had been through. Aaron let out a relieved laugh, breaking the tension. "I can't believe it. We're actually getting out of here." Jason didn't say anything. He just opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. One by one, we followed, piling into the car, the silence between us heavy with everything that had happened. As the engine roared to life, a collective breath of relief seemed to fill the car. We were leaving. We were actually leaving. The road out of the village, which had once twisted and turned on itself, now stretched ahead of us in a straight line. No tricks, no loops. We drove in silence for a long time, the village fading into the distance behind us, until it was nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed by the forest. But even as the trees closed in around us, even as the night stretched out before us like an endless black sea, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly free. I glanced at the others. Aaron was staring out the window, his face pale and drawn. Sarah sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes distant. Jason drove in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. None of us spoke, but the weight of what we had experienced hung over us like a dark cloud. We had broken the curse, or at least we thought we had. But at what cost? Then, as if reading my thoughts, Sarah broke the silence. Do you think we're really free? No one answered. The question hung in the air, too heavy, too frightening to address. We drove for hours, the forest around us dark and unchanging, the road stretching on endlessly. It wasn't until we passed a small, broken-down sign on the side of the road that the dread returned in full force. The sign was old, weathered, the letters barely legible, but I recognized it instantly. It was the name of the village. We've been here before, Jason muttered, his voice tight with panic. My heart sank as I looked out the window, and there was just up ahead through the trees the village. The same village we had just escaped from, standing there like a ghost in the night, waiting for us. No, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. No, this isn't possible. We left, but there it was. The fountain, the buildings, the villagers, back in their places, moving in that same mechanical rhythm, like nothing had ever changed. The car came to a stop. None of us moved. We just sat there, staring at the village in disbelief, our hearts pounding in our chests. We never left, Aaron said softly, his voice hollow. We never left. I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on us, suffocating us. The curse hadn't been broken. The village hadn't let us go. It had just let us think we were free, only to pull us back to the start. Jason slammed his hands against the steering wheel, his face twisted in anger and fear. We can't be stuck here. We can't. But deep down, we all knew the truth. The village had claimed us. We were part of its cycle now, just like the villagers. No matter how far we ran, how hard we tried to escape, we would always be brought back. The village wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and we were never getting out. The village stood silently, as it had for countless years, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to wander in, believing they could find a way out. But no one ever truly left the forgotten village.